Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to present my research during this meeting. But also thank you very much because the GSA Endowment Fund has actually enabled me to do quite a lot with my project, particularly in the method development stuff that I will sort of touch on during my talk. So at the moment, I'm sort of at the pointy end of my PhD, so I'm almost a month out from submitting, so it's quite a messy time for me, but it's kind of a really great time for me to be talking about my research because it's quite fresh and I'm really like in the middle of it. So my PhD broadly is looking at chalcophyre elements and oxygen fugacity in the upper mantle, and I primarily use geochemistry to sort of do this investigation. And a big research interest of mine is using novel technique developments to further probe elements that we haven't really had access to further understand processes occurring in the upper mantle. So a few of the big questions that I am interested in and what my PhD research is trying to address is a few bigger picture things. So first of all, when we think about chalcophyre and highly pseudophile elements, they're elements of great economic interest. But one of the big things that we still are a little bit uncertain about is how we get them from the mantle and place them into the crust. So in the mantle, sulfur, selenium, tellurium, copper, the PGEs are of extremely low abundance. So they constitute less than 2% of the mantle. And it's actually quite difficult to get them from the mantle and then up into the crust. So for example, in subduction zones, copper porphyries are well associated with subduction zones, but also with magmas that are very oxidized, enriched in volatiles, and enriched in sulfur, for example. So this association between oxidation and chalcophyre element abundance is less clear. But what we can sort of say is, or what we can sort of note is that subduction zones are more oxidized than, say, mid-ocean ridges. So this is kind of very exciting topic at the moment. There's lots of papers being published on a monthly basis. And it's what is causing subduction zone magmas to be more oxidized, and the association with a subducting slab being plunged into the mantle, releasing fluids and metasomatizing the upper mantle. We assume, or we think, that this has got something to do with it. So in placing or adding oxidized materials to the mantle produces oxidized and volatile rich magmas. And another question that I'm trying to sort of address with my PhD research is what can chalcophyre element systematics tell us about subduction zone processes? So in the instance of, say, for example, selenium and even tellurium, we have absolutely very little idea of what these elements look like in the mantle, how they behave, and that's primarily because they're extremely difficult to analyze. But a part of my PhD research has been developing a method so that we can analyze these elements and sort of see if they can give us more information about the partial melting or the dehydration of the slab, or even melt rock interactions as it migrates upwards. There's sort of like an interdependence, or like a circular relationship with sulfur and oxygen fugacity. So on the one side, sulfur in, for example, mid-ocean ridge magmas has very low solubility. So we can put about 1200 ppm of sulfur into a silicate magma until it starts to fractionate sulfides. So mid-ocean ridge magmas are sort of capped at this 1200 ppm mark. So in order to enrich or put more sulfur into a magma, we need to oxidize it. And so lots of experimental studies have looked into the solubility of sulfur, and they have seen or shown that you can put more sulfur in, or you can dissolve more sulfur in a magma as you oxidize it, so going from sulfide to sulfate. On the other hand, it's when we consider how we oxidize the mantle wedge, so the mantle overlying a subducting slab, when we think about what is actually going in there and what can actually oxidize, sulfur is the best candidate, because by going from sulfide to sulfate, it's an 8-electron transfer. And so in comparison to things like hydrogen, oxygen, or carbon, sulfur is the best candidate to actually produce these oxidized magmas. So on the one side, you need sulfur to oxidize the magma, but on the other hand, you also need lots of sulfur in order to enrich, if that makes sense. So it's a bit of a circular problem that is not very clear. So why sulfur, selenium, and tellurium? So tellurium, I'm actually not going to go into too much of this talk, but it's quite relevant to the method development stuff that I've done and to broader aspects of my PhD work. But sulfur, for example, is actually extremely susceptible to degassing and weathering because it's quite volatile. So when we're looking at subduction zone magmas, it's typically we don't see much sulfur because it's kind of popped away somewhere. So potentially, because selenium and tellurium are also group 16 elements on the periodic table, they should show similar chemical affinities and behavior to sulfur. So therefore, selenium and tellurium could be a potential good workaround or proxy elements to monitor the behavior of sulfur. So when we're looking at subduction zones, we have a slab component, and then we have the depleted upper mantle that slab component is being mixed into. And sort of distinguishing between the two can be quite difficult. So when we're studying arc magmas, it's actually quite difficult to sort of assess what the source of the magma looked like before the subduction slab was put in there. However, back arc basins are sort of like an intermediary between a mid-ocean ridge and a true arc-like magma, because although you have the subducting slab which goes into the source, you've also got decompression melting. So back arc basins are kind of an ideal setting to sort of assess the extent of which a mantle source and slab-derived components can influence oxygen fugacity and sulfur. So for this study, we have taken 25 natural glasses from 4 extensional zones in the Manus Basin located up here. And these are colored by geochemical types. So I've identified that there are 3 main magma types, those being mid-ocean ridge, back arc, and arc-like magmas. And so the Manus Basin is currently associated with the subduction of the Solomon Sea plate to the northward. It's actually an oblique of subduction. And then we have the present day arc front, which is the New Britain arc. Roughly about 10 million years ago, we saw this, the cessation of the subduction of the Pacific plate, which is located up here to the northeast, that was subducting to the southwest. And that is associated with the New Ireland arc front, which is now currently inactive. Going into a bit about the methods that I've used. So the 2 that I'll get into are the 2 most novel methods that I've used. So the calcifier elements, which I've used the triple quadrupole ICP-MS, which is what I use the endowment funds to sort of support and be able to do that method development. And then secondly, I've determined the oxidation or the oxygen fugacity of these magmas by using redox sensitive elements, so sulfur and iron speciation. And I use a technique called Zanes to do this. So the major problem with analyzing sulfur, selenium, and tellurium, particularly by an ICP-MS instrument, is 2 things. So first of all, in natural glasses, we basically don't have selenium and tellurium. It's very low abundance. So selenium is present in less than 450 ppb, and tellurium is less than 10 ppb. So you need instruments with very low detection limits. But on top of that, using ICP-MS instruments, we have the problem of interferences, and sulfur, selenium, and tellurium have really, really severe ones. So all of the interferences are derived from the gas that we use to basically ionize or create the plasma. And those are xenon, argon, and oxygen. So essentially, by using a triple quad, we can react sulfur, selenium, and tellurium with a reaction gas sort of shift away from those interferences. For a traditional ICP-MS instrument, we'll have this Q1 or a number one quadrupole, and a quadrupole acts as like a filter. So it rapidly measures each mass in a rapid order. But what the triple quad can do is you have the first filter. So in this case, I'll take masses 32, 80, and 128, which correspond to sulfur, selenium, and tellurium. And I can react them with nitrous oxide. And so we can mass shift them plus 16. And so in this regard, you do remove some of the interferences, but when you move to the second quadrupole, so your second mass filter, we're now going to be analyzing for sulfur double oxide, selenium oxide, and tellurium oxide. So we shift away. And therefore, this enables us to analyze sulfur, selenium, and tellurium with minimal or no interferences. I'm not going to go into too much depth about all the stuff that I've done, but essentially this method development was about testing different ways that I could enhance or the sensitivity or remove interferences. And so the main ways I did this was by adding nitrous oxide, but then also adding hydrogen to the laser carrier gas. So hydrogen has been shown to increase the temperature of the plasma, and consequently, this improves the ionization efficiency of these elements. So essentially, I've analyzed different masses of sulfur, selenium, and tellurium, and I've measured them en masse and then mass shifted products. So what I found was that nitrous oxide effectively removes the interferences by shifting them away. Adding hydrogen to the laser carrier gas significantly improved the detection limits for sulfur, selenium, and tellurium. And by using this method, we can analyze the largest masses of sulfur and selenium, which have the most severe interferences. So on mass 32 of sulfur and mass 80 of selenium. And so therefore we can obtain really good precision. Some of the first results from this, so I've analyzed a whole array of standards that are available to the geochemistry community and are quite often used in most labs that use laser ICP-MS. And on the left here, I'm showing you the results that I've got. So in the blue are the results that I've obtained, and in purple are the compiled values I've taken from published literature. And so for sulfur, we have pretty good agreement between our measured values and those that have been published in the literature. For selenium, it's a little bit more challenging to make the same assessment because there's significantly less published values available for selenium. And on top of that, the values that are available weren't necessarily obtained by using the ideal method. So whether or not those values are actually good or not is another conversation. But overall, we seem to be getting in the right range, and particularly for this VG2, which is a mid-ocean ridge glass, it's a natural glass, we're in the right range, which suggests that we're doing quite well, at least for accuracy for selenium. Tellurium, it's a completely different story because there is really no values available. So if anyone knows anyone doing tellurium analyses anywhere or that have values for tellurium in standards, please let me know. By using, for example, the NIST 612 or the 610 glasses and cross-calibrating, we do get a pretty good value on these, but that's not to say that those values are correct, because when we use them to then say do a calibration for a natural glass like BHVO, which has very low abundance, we completely overestimate. So whether or not this is actually related to the method, which I don't think so, I think it's more related to the calibration standards. Yeah, it needs more work. So if anyone's got tellurium values, please let me know, because I would love to add this to my work and see if we can improve this a bit further. Okay, so moving now on to the Zanes work. So Zanes is a synchrotron technique. So they're these enormous facilities. I went to one I didn't actually go there, I did it remotely, but in the Jesse Carr's beamline in Chicago. And over 2 different sessions, I analyzed the speciation of sulfur and I analyzed the speciation of iron. So iron is actually quite common as a redox proxy. In the literature, it's becoming very common, actually. You'll find it in a lot of published papers. But sulfur, on the other hand, has only really recently been realized as a potential good proxy for oxygen fugacity. And the reason that sulfur is probably a really good ideal proxy for oxygen fugacity is because iron only has a transition of 1 electron, so from iron 2+ to 3+. So when we relate that to oxygen fugacity, that transition occurs over 10 log units, which is quite enormous. So if you look here, I've got mid-ocean ridge mantle, mid-ocean ridge mantle, subarc mantle, and arc lavas, and these are the typical oxygen fugacity values that we would observe. And for sulfur, because we have an 8 electron exchange, is actually a much more precise proxy. And luckily enough, it happens right in the range of oxygen fugacity that we want to sort of investigate, particularly for the upper mantle. So I have also analyzed the sulfur speciation to sort of see how it works for the Manus Basin and, in a broader sense, for the upper mantle. So one of the big problems that we have with zanes is that you're basically exposing your sample to a very strong X-ray beam. And as a result, you can oxidize or reduce the glass, particularly if they're hydrous. So you do need to take some care and set up your analysis to avoid or reduce the effects of oxidation or reduction as much as possible, because otherwise your measured iron ratio or sulfur ratio will no longer reflect the actual oxygen fugacity that's been recorded in the samples. So for this study, what I did is I attenuated the beam using aluminium foil filters, I defocused the beam, and also reduced the exposure time to the sample, particularly for those that had water content. And on the graphs over here, these are time series plots, so showing you the relative intensity of the iron 3+ peak, and exposing the sample to the beam and seeing how that changes with time. We expect that you can actually reduce or oxidize, so we would see sort of a little wiggle or change in the relative intensity of the iron 3+. And as you can see here, with 3 different types of photon fluxes, we don't actually see any significant change or out of error variation to the oxidation of these samples. And the same thing done here, I've tested this on samples with different water contents. So here I have a sample with about half weight percent, 1 weight percent, and then almost 1.5 weight percent water. And basically what this is showing is that we don't see any measurable changes with water contents and the settings that we're using here. For this, I also use standards to do the peak fitting. These are from Andrew Berry, so they're a set of synthetic glass standards. And over here are examples of the spectra that we obtain and how I have peak fitted them to basically calculate the iron ratio subsequently. For the sulfur, it's less standard dependent, and that's because there's more components that we can fit to the spectra that make a little bit more sense, I suppose. But of course, it does also suffer from beam damage. But luckily enough, when you do have beam damage, what happens is that you reduce your sulfate to sulfite. And because sulfite doesn't necessarily naturally occur in glasses, or at least we believe it doesn't, we can make a correction for this. So any beam damage that was present during my analyses, they have been corrected for. And to determine the sulfur ratios, I've taken the relative intensity of the sulfate, sulfite, and sulfide peaks to calculate sulfur ratio that I'll present in a minute. Okay, so now moving on to the actual Manus Basin glasses. So the 25 glasses that I have here, broadly, they range between basalt to andesitic in composition. Majority of them are tholeiitic basalts, but some of them do fall onto the calc-alkaline trend. Their trace element abundance is sort of a bit more telling about how they formed. In the orange or the yellow is the mid-ocean ridge basalts, which broadly follow a typical pattern of a normal morb. So if you can see it, it's the red dotted line on these plots. see have positively sloping rare earth patterns. The arc basalts, which are in the green, they have negatively sloping, so they're enriched in the light rare earths and depleted in the heavy rare earths. The arc basalts also have the highest enrichment in the large iron lithophiles, so these are the fluid mobile elements, and they also have the greatest depletions in the high field strength elements. So those are the ones that aren't fluid mobile and tend to only be changed with partial melting, for example. So these trace element trends sort of already suggest that the mid-ocean ridge basalts don't really have much of a subduction component, and so are more representative of a depleted more mantle. And then the arc basalts with the enrichments and the depletions in the high field strength elements sort of suggest an involvement of a slab component. And the back arc basin basalts in purple are sort of intermediary, so sort of fit between the arc and the mid-ocean ridges. Although notably, we do have 3 back arc basin basalts that are sort of anomalous to the rest of the data set. And these samples also have high phosphorus, thorium, and titanium. These have been looked at in the literature. Some people suggest that there might be a carbonatite in the source. Others have said a mantle plume, which is very unlikely. But ultimately, these magmas are unlikely to have fractionated from a common source magma. So it's likely there's something else being mixed into the source where these have erupted from. Now looking at the calcophile element systematics. So the mid-ocean ridge magmas have sulfur contents that are quite comparable with a typical mid-ocean ridge basalt. So these are the grey points. And then as we go through to the arc samples from the BAB, the sulfur contents decrease. And so the arc samples have the lowest sulfur. And then the same thing can be said about selenium. So the highest selenium is found in the mid-ocean ridge-like magmas, and then decrease all the way to arc. So this sort of suggests that sulfur and selenium are behaving relatively in the same way because they are both increasing and then decreasing in the same manner. On the right-hand side, I have copper over selenium versus magnesium oxide. And the reason I've chosen this ratio is because copper and selenium are both compatible in sulfide, but have varying compatibility. So copper tends to be more compatible in sulfide and selenium is less so. So during melting, you would expect your copper selenium ratio to increase because you have more selenium going into the melt comparable to copper. And then if you're removing sulfides or crystallizing sulfides, you expect this ratio to decrease because copper is more compatible. As we see with the mid-ocean ridge basalt, as we go down in magnesium oxide, so increasing melt differentiation, we see this ratio decrease. However, for the back arc and the arc-like magmas, this is much more variable and they tend to increase. So this sort of suggests that the mid-ocean ridge magmas are sulfide saturated, which is quite consistent with the behavior of mid-ocean ridge magmas. And then the magmas that are, have the higher copper selenium ratios are a bit more variable and sort of suggest the same thing as compared with, say, the Kilauea samples or Marianas, which are also more oxidized and sulfur undersaturated. So one of the remarkable things about this, I suppose, is when we're looking at subduction zone magmas, we assume that as you oxidize a magma, they also become enriched in sulfur, but this is obviously, we've got a slab component that's been added, which is sort of the arc samples that are representing this, and they have the lower sulfur content, which is kind of a bit strange. So here I have the measured iron ratios and sulfur ratios that I did by Zanes, plotted against sulfur content. These red or pink fields are what a typical range we would observe in a mid-ocean ridge basalt. So our mid-ocean ridge basalt or like magmas have sulfur contents and iron and sulfur ratios comparable to what has been published. However, what we see is that sulfur contents decreases with increasing oxidation. So as we increase our sulfur or iron ratio, and this is reflected in both sulfur and iron ratios. So this is completely at odds at what we expect to see with increasing oxidation. we should be able to put more sulfur into a melt as we oxidize it, as demonstrated on this plot on the right. So this line here sort of shows you at QFM0, which is roughly where this intersect of this line is. We are sort of capped at 1200 ppm, which we see, but as we increase oxidation, sulfur should also increase, which we do not see. So before we can sort of make a further assessment, we need to sort of rule out or see whether or not degassing has played a part in the low sulfur content we observe. Because sulfur is very volatile, we do tend to, or it is very susceptible to degassing. So as a first step, what I have done is I've calculated the water saturation curve for samples in the Manus Basin. And the reason I've done this is because in the presence of a water vapor phase, sulfur will partition quite readily into that vapor. So as you degas, it will go quite readily. But that's not to say just because you haven't lost water that you haven't lost sulfur. So there's a few other lines of evidence that suggest that these haven't suffered sulfur degassing. So first of all, they've erupted under very high water pressure, so roughly about 2,000 meters below sea level. Sulfur, selenium, copper contents all correlate with one another, and copper usually doesn't degas. And they all correlate with melting indices such as magnesium oxide and yttrium contents. Another line of evidence is the fact that we have a sulfur-selenium ratio that is very alike to the primitive mantle ratio. So while selenium may degas, it's certainly not as susceptible to degassing as sulfur. So in the case that you might have sulfur loss, we would expect quite a variation in this ratio, or as you can see over here to the left, top left, magmas from the Northwest Lower Basin underwent sulfur degassing, and this is kind of what you end up with. So these few things sort of suggest that the low sulfur contents in our samples are unlikely to be as a result of degassing. Okay, so now moving on to sort of understand a bit better about the subduction component, because in published literature, they say that you can get all these really sulfur-rich magmas by putting sulfur-rich materials into the mantle wedge. So the Manus Basin, we have published values taken from a paper in 1998 by Woodhead, which are these sort of blobby fields that I've plotted, which represent the Solomon sediments, altered oceanic crust, and the Manus Basin mob and members. The slab component we assume is going to be mixing between some part of sediment and altered oceanic crust, and then mix between the mob or depleted mob mantle of the Manus Basin. And by doing a mixing model, we come up with roughly about a 95% altered oceanic crust and a 5% sediment component. And this is also sort of reiterated with the strontium isotope. So we see a slight elevation in the strontium isotopes with the increasing subduction component. And then the same with the barium-niobium ratio. So barium is a fluid mobile element where niobium is not. So barium and niobium typically become enriched as you increase your slab component. So what does this now look like? Sulfur and redox. So sulfur, when we compare with the lead isotope ratio, we see that it decreases. So we go from high to low with increasing slab component, and you have quite a nice trend forming. And then we see the opposite with iron ratios, so our index for oxidation state of the magmas. So the mid-ocean ridges become more oxidized with the increasing slab component. So what this already sort of starts to suggest is that, one, you don't need necessarily to have sulfur to oxidize the mantle wedge, as currently the literature is suggesting you need to have. But what this might also suggest is whether slab components actually drive the oxidation of the mantle wedge. If you need sulfur to do it, can you actually, is the oxidation actually related to the slab component to begin with? So as a next step, I've investigated the partial melting behavior of the elements in the Manus Basin. And so on the top here, I've modeled the partial melting trend for niobium, and on the bottom for barium. And as we can see that we can reproduce quite well the niobium contents, which are fluid immobile. And then for barium, we don't necessarily reproduce them very well, except for the mid-ocean ridge magmas, which have the lowest slab component. So this departure is most likely coming from a slab addition. What is also notable about these partial melting trends is that they estimate almost up to 50% of melting, which is extremely unrealistic. But this more likely represents or reflects a prior depletion of the source before these magmas were erupted, which is quite typical of back arc basins and arc magmas, as you have fluid flux melting that can enhance the amount of melt sets have already been extracted previously. So what do sulfur, selenium, and copper do, for example? So I have modeled the partitioning, or sorry, the partial melting of sulfur and selenium by assuming that all of their contents are hosted in sulfide. And as we can see, their contents are produced quite well. I have modeled different scenarios, so starting with different sulfur contents in the Manus Basin source. So the mid-ocean ridge magmas reproduce quite well by starting with something between like 120 to 100 ppm sulfur in the source, so of sulfide. And then as we melt, we go towards lower starting values of 50 ppm. And so this kind of fits quite well with the prior depletion model. And then the same thing can be said for selenium and also copper. So what does this sort of suggest about the whole picture of oxidizing the mantle wedge? Well, first of all, if you're going to have a sulfide in the source, that already implies that the source was not oxidized to begin with. So this suggests if you've got sulfide and you've melted it to produce the sulfur, selenium, and copper contents that we observed, then these magmas must have become oxidized after partial melting. And this is kind of really at odds with our current understanding of the dynamics sort of in subduction zones, because we presume that by the addition of fluids coming from the slab, that this initiates or enhances the partial melting. So potentially this is suggesting that either fluids weren't there to begin with and they came afterwards, or that the fluids actually have played no part in oxidizing the mantle wedge to begin with. So now I have made a comparison or directly compared how my measured sulfur content and speciation compares with our current understanding of models relating sulfur and iron speciation, but also the solubility of sulfur within these magmas. So at the top here, I have my measured sulfur ratios and my measured iron ratios. And I've also compared them with current models relating sulfur and iron redox equilibria. So first of all, what this sort of demonstrates or reiterates is that these samples are not degassed or unlikely to be degassed, because degassing should lead to a reduction in both the sulfur and iron ratios. In the middle graph here, what I have done, I have calculated the total expected sulfur content. So this is using a solubility model of the total amount of sulfur you can dissolve in a melt for a given oxidation state. So I'm using iron here. So these sort of, I'll kind of think of the word, less bright points are the modeled contents, and then the points that are kind of more colored are my measured. And so for the mid-ocean ridge samples, the model reproduces quite well the observed content that we see for sulfur. However, for the back arc basin and arc magmas, there's a significant departure. So what this suggests is, while a sulfur solubility model might say, okay, oxidation leads to higher sulfur, or you can put more sulfur into a melt, this does not necessarily mean that you're going to have more sulfur. And then this plot on the bottom is basically the calculated sulfide content that should be present for this given oxygen fugacity, compared with my actual measured sulfur contents. And you can see there's a really nice agreement. So this kind of tells us that already that sulfide is controlling primarily the sulfur contents in the Manus Basin. So to sort of summarize everything, there's quite a few points. So first of all, low sulfur contents in arc magmas do not always result from degassing, as is commonly believed. Therefore, samples with low sulfur content should be revisited. Additions from a subducting slab do not necessarily enrich the mantle wedge with sulfur, and the oxidation state of the mantle wedge is not necessarily driven by the addition of sulfate. And then lastly, the presence of sulfide in the source of Manus Basin magmas suggests that either oxidizing fluids are added after partial melting, or alternatively, fluids were present at the onset of partial melting but have not played a role in oxidizing Manus Basin arc and BAB magmas. Thank you very much.